Alright, so I just got finished playing the new Total War Warhammer Bretonnia DLC. I played the honeymoon period, as I call it, which is about the first hour of the DLC. Typically for DLC, I would say it should be like half hour, but it depends on the game. And in the case of a Total War game, you're going in for the long haul. Wow, what a DLC. I really, really liked it. It's not something that I would say is good for the average person to come into. Like if you just got Total War Warhammer and you're like, oh man, they just released this free DLC, what they call free LC. I'm gonna go right into it and see how it is. Not a good idea, because there's a lot of mechanics at play here. Two of the biggest mechanics that they add is the peasant economy and the chivalry economy. Those two mechanics make a big difference in this game. I went in thinking that I was just going to be able to go in, start a war with, the nearby people like I usually do, start raiding to pull them out of their town, because the AI is somewhat predictable in that sense, depending, but usually they'll come out to fight you. And that's a way that you get the advantage, because if you have only one army and they have one army and you're both full stack, your army might be able to defeat them, but inside their castle, that's not going to happen. The Bretonnia campaign forced me to change it up. And there's a couple of reasons why. Like I mentioned, the peasant and the chivalry economy, and I'll explain kind of how those factor into this. So the peasant economy means that you're limited to a certain number of peasant units. All of the infantry, as far as I can see, are peasants, other than like heroes and lords. All of your archers, siege units. So your starting cavalry are, but the cavalry afterwards, the advanced cavalry, are not. That is great for the lore of Bretonnia. Bretonnia, if you don't know, is kind of more of a cavalry-focused faction. By having it so that you have the limited number of peasants you can have in your army, cavalry kind of becomes a necessary focus. You need to have more cavalry, which puts your armies kind of as they should be in the actual Warhammer tabletop game. It's great. It forces you as a player to change your armies from mine, which are typically like largely infantry and missile focused, unless I'm playing as vampire counts, obviously, because vampire counts do not have missile units. But with this, I was forced to kind of put a lot more cavalry into my army. And that actually changed kind of how I was going in the early game. Well, a couple things did. The morale unit in Bretonnia is control. Starting out, you do not have a lot of control. And I think in the first turn, there was a green skin incursion, which meant for like 20 turns, there was a negative 20 on control. Now, I didn't really pay attention to this at first, because usually the capital regions are pretty, hardy. Like, you can just kind of not worry about them and leave because of the capital region. That wasn't the case this time, and I left to try to go fight Marienburg, and all of a sudden I noticed the control going completely awry. So I had to go back to my home province, and even with my army, which was fairly sizable, the control was still going in the negative. So I had to research tech to handle control. I had to demolish a building that I had. Originally I had the smithy, because the smithy allowed for me to get armored men-at-arms and spearmen. But once I realized that men-at-arms and spearmen were all peasants, I kind of felt like, well, that's not going to help me right now. So then I got rid of the smithy and put in place a tavern. And that tavern allowed me to increase my control to 0. It was 13 turns before I even got into positive control. It was 9 turns just to get to 0. So I was on the edge of a rebellion because I wasn't really expecting this. That was rather fascinating. The campaign for Bretonnia is not challenging in the sense that there are all these enemies, and they're gonna, like in the medieval 2 way, where there's all these enemies around you and they're gonna like gang up on you and destroy you. It's challenging in the fact that you have 2 different economies to manage with each other. So that peasant economy, as I mentioned before, that is gained by owning towns or owning regions. Each region gives you 2, and your capital city gives you 8. I never actually got, like in the just the hour that I played, which usually if I'm playing a campaign, an hour is enough to get like a few regions, I got exactly 0. Because Marienburg was hard to seize, and eventually I just kind of couldn't do because of the control issue. I had to go back to my home province to balance things out for a few turns. And Confederation is a bit more difficult. In most campaigns where there is a Confederation option, it's available for all those factions from the start. And basically, as soon as a faction starts turning my way, I go and try to confederate with them. Right when they get into that area where I know I can confederate with this faction, I go and do it. Not so Bretonnia. Initially, I thought there was no confederation option, which I was like, well, that's weird. Why would you have this Bretonnia faction and all these different, options, and then you just don't allow the opportunity to confederate with them? That's kind of abnormal from what I've seen so far. Well, there is a confederation option, and it's locked behind the tech tree. So I had to go into the tech tree to kind of select a faction, and I had to choose actually initially between Artois and Lyonesse. And I chose Lyonesse because they were just that turn they started to edge out in my favor. But even with that, even with Lyonesse, and once I had it, and it gives you a plus 100 diplomatic relations, which should make it pretty easy. However, the other factor for confederation is military strength, and given the peasant economy, I couldn't really get as much military strength. So I kind of had to rely on them faltering a bit, or me kind of taking over another region to showcase my power to them. And that wasn't able to happen within the hour. The chivalry economy is a way of kind of increasing your leadership. If you let it fall too low, then it starts to negatively affect your entire faction. I didn't necessarily want it to fall too low, and things that get it to fall too low are raiding and ambushing. And I typically rely on those a lot in a campaign because it gives you a better chance of defeating stronger enemies, either by pulling them out of their faction when you're raiding, which also gives you money, which is nice, or by kind of tricking an army to follow one of your smaller armies while a larger army is sitting by ambushing. Or just when you recognize you know where they're going and you set an ambush army, they'll go walk right past. Not really sure if you ran off some other direction or whatever, and boom, trap triggered, and you can defeat their army a lot easier. Especially with a bunch of cavalry like you would do with Bretonnia. But by having this chivalry mechanic, those things aren't very chivalrous. Raiding involves possibly hurting citizens or peasants. Ambushing is just a dirty tactic. So therefore, you're encouraged not to do those things. That changes up the entire way that I have to play the campaign. And that's part of the reason why I think that this is a good DLC and wouldn't necessarily be a good faction to include in the main game, because in the main game, you're kind of getting introduced to all this stuff. You don't really know what's unique and what's new, what's different. This throws a whole bunch of stuff at you that's different that really kind of gets you to change the way that you think. If you went from Bretonnia to the Empire, it would just seem like it was an easier campaign to manage, and that's about it. But if you have to go from the Empire to Bretonnia, all of a sudden there's a lot more challenges into playing that game. When I started the campaign, my initial goal was to conquer Marienburg, because you're at war with Marienburg to start, and Marienburg is a really rich faction, so conquering them gets me a lot of money, which I typically like to do. Like, one of the things that I like to boost first in Civilization games and first in Total War games is economy. So conquering Marienburg would have allowed me to get a better economy. But eventually I had to back off on that idea, because when I went to go fight Marienburg, that control issue that I mentioned earlier came into play, so I had to go back to my main province. And at that point, Marienburg eventually sued for peace. And I kind of just, I was like, yeah, that's fine, because I don't really know when I'm going to be able to fight you right now. I'd much rather focus on my own faction. Plus, there was technically a Greenskin faction that I could have fought, but I wouldn't have been able to gain their region. Overall, I would say, as far as a DLC goes for Total War Warhammer, the Bretonnia DLC is actually probably one of my favorites. I really like the Beastmen DLC for how it played out in the combat, which actually I never even got into a battle in the Bretonnia DLC because of how much I had to manage the campaign. But that's part of the reason I really like it. Combat and that battles in Total War are always the strength. They've always been very strong, and people have played Bretonnia with just a few units and have managed to make it a strong faction. Now that there's more, I'm sure that's going to just blossom into a huge bunch of ideas. But often in Total War games, the campaign isn't as exciting as the battles. And this is a case where I think it is. So I am really surprised by this DLC. I liked it a lot. There's a strong Arthurian feel to it, which I really love. I'm a big fan of the Arthurian legends. My favorite game is Dark Age of Camelot, and part of that is because of the Arthurian feel that it gives, because, obviously Camelot. And the Wood Elf DLC, I wasn't as much of a fan of as the Beastmen, which is strange because I typically like archer units, and I did like that aspect of it. I felt like the amber mechanic was just a different economy in there that was just kind of similar to other economies. By having the chivalry and the peasant economy stuff into this game, it changes up how you play the game. Whereas with the Wood Elves, it just changes up kind of what buildings I build. This changes completely how I go about the campaign, and that's kind of really exciting to me. I would say this is the best DLC that they've had for Total War Warhammer. I cannot wait to see what they do for Total War Warhammer 2, which should be coming up sometime later in the year. Yeah, it was great.